Hey, welcome. If you've watched my other stories, you know what's coming, but not this time. This one's gonna surprise you. Stay till the end.
The highway narrowed into County Road, then into memory, and Micah felt the change in his chest before he saw it in the landscape. 10 years should have been enough to erase the particular slant of afternoon light over the Kentucky hills, the way the fields folded into each other like a hand closing. It hadn't. He gripped the wheel of his rental car and watched the mile markers count down to a place he'd sworn he would never return to. And yet here he was, driving toward it, with a black suit hanging in a garment bag across the back seat and a hollow ache lodged somewhere beneath his ribs. His father was dead. That was the fact of it, blunt and immovable, and no amount of distance or time had prepared him for how strange the words felt even now, 3 days after his Aunt Deborah's phone call had cracked his careful, curated life in California down the middle. Asterisk, your daddy's gone, Micah. You need to come home. Asterisk, home. As if the word still applied to a place that had spent his entire childhood trying to make him disappear into something smaller, someone quieter, someone who didn't flinch every time another boy's shadow crossed a fence line. The Cutler farmhouse came into view, first, weathered white paint gone grey at the edges, the porch sagging in the same place it always had. Micah slowed the car without meaning to, some old animal instinct pulling his foot off the gas as the property unspooled beside the road. His family's land, his father's land, spreading gold and green under a sky bruised with the beginnings of evening. He hadn't expected the sight of it to hurt. He had spent a decade telling himself he felt nothing for this place, that he'd cut it out of himself clean as a surgeon's incision. But grief did not care what a person had told himself. It came anyway, uninvited, dragging up things he thought he'd buried for good. He parked the car at the end of the gravel drive rather than pulling all the way up to the house, needing a moment, needing to breathe air that smelled like cut hay and diesel and rain that hadn't fallen yet. He got out and stood there a long moment, hands in his pockets, watching the fence line that separated his family's property from the Hargrove land beyond it. That same crooked wooden fence that had divided two feuding families since before Micah was born, since some ancient dispute over water rights or property lines or pride. Nobody quite remembered which, only that it had calcified into hatred, passed down like an heirloom. Micah made his way along the fence out of some pool he didn't examine too closely, some need to see it again before he had to walk into that house and face the empty rooms, the neighbours with their casseroles and their pity, the whole performance of grief he wasn't ready for. The wood was grey, split in places, patched over the years with mismatched boards, wire sagging in the low spots. He remembered climbing it as a boy, just to spite the family on the other side. Remembered the particular fury of being 16 and finding fresh flowers he'd planted, trampled into the mud, remembered blaming, correctly, as it turned out, the Hargrove boy for it. He was so lost in the memory that he didn't hear the truck pull up on the other side of the property until the door slammed, until boots hit gravel, until a voice he hadn't heard in a decade cut through the still evening air like it had never left. Well, I'll be damned. Micah turned, and time did something strange and vertiginous, folding in on itself so that for one disorienting second he was 17 again, standing at this exact fence, hating this exact person with the pure, uncomplicated fury of adolescence. But the boy who had haunted his childhood was gone, replaced by a man, broad through the shoulders, in a way that spoke of years of physical labor, forearms corded with muscle, skin tanned deep and weathered from sun that Micah's California life had never demanded of him. Theo Hargrove stood on the other side of the fence in a faded flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, sandy hair longer than Micah remembered, streaked lighter at the ends like he spent every daylight hour outdoors, which he probably did. His blue eyes hadn't changed at all, That was the thing that struck Micah hardest, those eyes, sharp and assessing, exactly as they'd been when they were boys, trading insults across this same stretch of splintered wood. Theo. Micah said the name like it cost him something, because it did. Heard you were coming back. Theo's voice was rougher than Micah remembered, low and unhurried, carrying the same drawl but deepened, matured. He leaned one forearm against the top fence rail, and Micah hated how natural the gesture looked, how it made Theo seem like he owned the ground he stood on. Sorry about your dad. The words were correct, the sentiment appropriate, but there was something guarded beneath them, something that made Micah's spine straighten. I doubt that. Something flickered across Theo's face, not quite anger, something more complicated. You doubt a lot of things about me. Always did. Given our history, can you blame me? Our history. Theo huffed out something that wasn't quite a laugh. That's one word for it. They stood there, 10 feet and 10 years apart, and Micah felt the weight of every summer of his childhood pressing down on him at once. Outing matches over property lines, the pranks that escalated into something meaner, the particular cruelty boys were capable of when they'd been taught by their fathers exactly who to hate and why. He remembered Theo's father shouting at his own father across this very fence, remembered the word arst, thief, arstis, and arsty, liar, ostie, thrown like stones, remembered absorbing all of it into his bones, until hating Theo Hargrove felt less like a choice and more like a law of nature. You look different, Theo said finally, and there was something unreadable in his tone, something that made the back of Micah's neck prickle with heat he refused to name. It's been 10 years, Theo. People change. Some people. Theo's gaze moved over him, not unkindly, but thoroughly, in a way that made Micah acutely aware of the wrinkled state of his travel clothes, the tired lines under his eyes, the general disarray of a man who had boarded a plane 4 hours after receiving the worst phone call of his adult life. Guess California agreed with you. Guess the farm agreed with you, Micah shot back, gesturing vaguely at the breadth of him, the sun-darkened skin, before he could stop himself, before he could remember that noticing things about Theo Hargrove's body was not a road he wanted to travel down. Not now, or ever, especially not standing at this fence with his father barely cold in the ground. Theo's mouth twitched, almost a smile quickly suppressed. Somebody's got to run it, especially since your daddy. He stopped himself, seemed to reconsider. Sorry. Bad timing. There's no good timing for this, Micah said. And for a moment the old armor cracked, just slightly, just enough that some genuine exhaustion bled through. I haven't even seen the house yet. I've been standing at this fence for 5 minutes. Theo studied him for a long moment, and Micah braced for something cutting, some old wound reopened, because that was what they did. That was the entire architecture of whatever this was between them. But instead, Theo just nodded, slow, and said, "Funeral's Thursday. Yeah, I'll be there." A pause. "My mother will, anyway. Probably me too." "Why would you?" Micah started, some old defensive instinct rearing up, and then stopped himself, because grief had worn him thin enough that he didn't have the energy for a fight he used to relish. "Never mind, it doesn't matter." "No," Theo agreed quietly. "Guess it doesn't anymore." There was something in the way he said it. Asterisk anymore. That snagged in Micah's chest like a hook. Some implication he didn't have the bandwidth to examine. He looked away first, back toward the farmhouse waiting for him, with its dark windows and its silence, and when he looked back, Theo was already turning, already walking back toward his truck, shoulders set in a way that looked almost like retreat, though Micah couldn't have said from what. "See you around, Cutler," Theo called over his shoulder, and the old surname in that old voice landed strangely, half insult and half something Micah. didn't have a name for. Micah didn't answer. He stood at the fence until the truck pulled away down the gravel road, dust rising gold in the last of the evening light, and told himself the tightness in his chest was grief and nothing else, and certainly nothing to do with the particular blue of Theo Hargrove's eyes. The lawyer's letter arrived 4 days after the funeral, dense with language about easements and boundary lines, and a decades-old property dispute that had apparently never been formally resolved, only ignored, the way so many things between the Cutlers and the Hargroves had been ignored, left to fester under the surface like a wound that never properly healed. Aunt Deborah delivered the news over breakfast with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had buried a brother and had no patience left for anyone's feelings, including her own. "The fence needs mending, regardless of what any lawyer says," she told Micah, sliding a mug of coffee across the table like a peace offering. "Cows don't care about legal technicalities, and neither does the Hargrove bull, which got loose into your daddy's south pasture twice last month already. You're going to go over there and fix that fence with Theo, and you're going to do it before something worse happens." "Aunt Deb." I'm not asking Micah. Her eyes, so like his father's had been, softened just slightly. "I know it's hard. I know what that boy's family did to yours, what your daddy believed for 30 years. But your daddy's gone now, and holding on to that fight isn't going to bring him back. It's just going to leave you all alone out here with nobody but ghosts." So it was that Micah found himself 3 days later, standing at the same stretch of broken fence, gloves too stiff on his hands, a post-hole digger leaning against his leg, waiting for Theo Hargrove to show up and share in the deeply unwelcome intimacy of manual labor. Theo arrived in his truck bed loaded with fresh lumber and a roll of wire, and he climbed out already in work clothes, jeans worn soft and pale at the knees, a grey t-shirt that clung damp to his chest within the hour. Once the Kentucky sun started doing what Kentucky sun did in the heavy part of summer, he didn't say much at first beyond a clipped greeting, and Micah matched his silence, grateful for it, grateful for anything that let them exist near each other, without conversation. It didn't last, of course. It never had, between them. "Holding that wrong," Theo said 20 minutes in, watching Micah wrestle with a post that refused to sit straight in its hole. "I know how to hold a shovel." "Theo didn't say shovel," said Post. Theo crossed the space between them without waiting for permission, and Micah stiffened as he approached, some old reflex bracing for a fight that didn't come. Theo just adjusted the angle of the wood with an easy, practiced motion, one hand steadying it while the other gestured for Micah to pack the dirt. "There. Now it won't fall over first strong wind. 10 years running that farm, and you've turned into a fence post philosopher. 10 years in California, and you forgot how anything actually works." Theo's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that something in Micah's chest reacted before his brain could stop it. They worked like that for a while, trading barbs that felt less venomous than they once had, worn smooth at the edges by time, more habit than genuine cruelty. The sun climbed higher, sweat gathering at the back of Micah's neck, his California soft hands already blistering despite the gloves. He was carrying a fresh post toward the next hole when his boot caught on a root hidden in the tall grass, and the world tilted violently, the weight of the lumber dragging him sideways toward the ground. He didn't fall. A hand caught his arm hard and sudden, Theo's grip closing around his bicep with a strength that stopped his momentum entirely, hauling him back upright before he even understood what had happened. For a moment they were close, closer than they'd been in a decade. Close enough that Micah could see the fine lines at the corners of Theo's eyes, could feel the heat radiating off his skin, could smell sun and sweat and something clean beneath it that he had no business noticing. "Easy," Theo said low, and there was nothing sharp in it at all. "I had it," Micah said, too fast pulling back before the warmth of that grip could settle into something he'd have to think about later. Sure you did. But Theo's voice had lost its usual edge, and when Micah dared to glance at him, there was something unguarded in his expression. Something that looked almost like concern, quickly smoothed over into indifference the moment he realized he'd been caught feeling it. They didn't speak again for a long while. After that, the silence different, now thicker, charged with something neither of them examined out loud. Micah set the post in its hole, hands that weren't quite steady, and told himself it was only the heat. The day settled into something Micah hadn't expected, a rhythm, quiet and unspoken, that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both showed up for anyway. Every evening after the worst of the heat broke, he'd find Theo already at the fence line, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, and something in Micah's chest would loosen just slightly at the sight of him, though he refused to name what that something was. They worked well together, better than either of them probably wanted to admit. Theo set the posts with the same steady patience he seemed to bring to everything, testing the ground before he sank the auger, checking the level twice, even when Micah could tell by eye it was already true. Micah handled the wire, the fittings, the smaller work that didn't require Theo's brute strength, but did require a kind of care Theo didn't have patience for. It was almost companionable the way they moved around each other. Now, passing tools without being asked, anticipating the next step before it was spoken. On the fourth evening, they took a break in the shade of the old oak that marked the halfway point of the fence line, the same tree they used to climb as kids to spy on each other's farms, back when hatred had felt so simple and so total. Now they sat a careful few feet apart in the grass, backs against the trunk, a thermos of water passing between them. "You ever think it's strange," Theo said, not looking at him, "that we're out here fixing something our fathers spent 30 years trying to keep broken?" Micah huffed something like a laugh, tipping his head back against the bark. "I think about it every day I'm out here." Theo was quiet for a moment, turning the cap of the thermos over in his calloused fingers. "Sarah left in March," he said, so abruptly it took Micah a second to place the name. Theo's fiancée, the wedding invitation Micah's mother had mentioned once, with the particular carefulness of someone delivering news she wasn't sure how to feel about. Called it off. Said she didn't think I ever really wanted it. The house, the dogs, all of it. Micah didn't know what to say. So for once he didn't try to fill the silence with something clever or sharp. He just waited. "She wasn't wrong," Theo admitted, voice low, almost swallowed by the evening air. "I kept telling myself I did. Kept thinking if I just stayed the course, it would feel right eventually. It never did." He glanced sideways, and there was something raw in his face that Micah had never seen there before, not once in all the years they'd known each other. "Nobody in town knows yet." "Not really. My mother knows, obviously, but everyone else still asks when the wedding is, and I don't know how to tell them there isn't one. Feels like admitting I failed at something everyone expected me to be good at." The admission hung there in the humid air, fragile in a way that didn't match anything Micah remembered about Theo Callahan. The boy who'd once dared him to jump off the grain silo roof into a hay pile. The boy who'd never once, in 18 years of rivalry, shown him anything but bravado and scorn. This was different. This was a man who had been carrying something heavy and quiet for months alone, in a town too small to hold secrets and too loud with expectation to make space for the truth. "I get that," Micah said finally, and it surprised him how easily the words came. "Not the same thing, obviously. But leaving here, moving to the city, everyone back home, acting like I'd become some stranger, just because I wanted something different than what my dad wanted for me." He picked at the grass beside his knee, not quite meeting Theo's eyes. "Took me 2 years before I stopped introducing myself as being from here, like I could just cut it out of myself if I didn't say it enough. Did it work? No, Micah said, and something in his own voice betrayed how tired that truth still made him, even now. Turns out, you can't really outrun a place that raised you. It just waits. Theo huffed a soft laugh, but there wasn't any mockery in it, only recognition. Yeah, I know that feeling. You never left, though. No, Theo agreed. Guess I've been running in place instead. He looked out over the fence line, half-mended, morning light catching gold in the tips of the grass. Sometimes I think that's worse. They sat there longer than either of them intended, the shade shifting slowly around them as the sun dropped lower, neither of them in any hurry to break the quiet that had settled between them, not the old silence of mutual contempt, but something new, something neither of them dared to look at too closely. When Micah finally stood to keep working, his knees stiff from sitting too long, Theo caught his eye for just a moment, and there was nothing guarded in it at all. "Thanks," Theo said. "For?" "Not." "I don't know." "What making it into something?" "I wouldn't do that," Micah said, and meant it. For the first time in over a decade, when Theo looked at him, Micah didn't feel like an enemy. He felt, for reasons he wasn't ready to examine, like someone Theo actually wanted standing beside him. The storm came on fast, the way summer storms in that part of the country always did. A green tint to the sky one moment, and the next, the wind ripping through the tree line, hard enough to strip leaves from their branches, thunder cracking low and close. Micah and Theo had been working the last stretch of fence near the old barn, trying to beat the weather, when the first sheet of rain hit them sideways, soaking through their shirts in seconds. Barn. Theo shouted over the wind, already grabbing the toolbox, and Micah didn't argue, sprinting after him across the churned mud of the field toward the looming shape of the old structure, its wood siding silvered with age, one of the last remaining buildings that had technically belonged to neither farm, and both of them. Straddling the property line, like a monument to the feud itself. They shoved through the door together, stumbling into the dim, hay-scented dark, and Theo hauled it shut behind them, just as the sky opened up, in earnest rain hammering the tin roof in a roar that swallowed every other sound. Lightning flashed through the gaps in the siding, illuminating the barn in stark white bursts. Old stalls, a hayloft half collapsed at one end, dust motes hanging thick in the air. "Well," Theo said, breathless, wringing water out of the hem of his shirt. "Guess we're not finishing tonight. Guess not." Micah dropped the toolbox with a clatter and ran a hand through his soaked hair, feeling the chill already settling into his skin now that the adrenaline of the run was fading. The temperature had dropped fast with the storm, the barn cool and damp, and he could feel goosebumps rising along his arms. They found an old horse blanket in one of the stalls, stiff with age but dry, and a scattering of hay bales that Theo dragged into a rough pile near the center of the barn, away from the worst of the drafts leaking through the walls. It wasn't much, but it was something, and when Micah sat down on the hay beside him, their shoulders brushed, and neither of them moved away. "Remember when we used to dare each other to sleep out here?" Theo said after a while, his voice pitched low to carry under the drumming rain. "Ghost stories about Old Man Whitfield's cattle that supposedly died in this barn back in the 50s. Micah laughed despite himself, surprised by how easily it came. "You told me there was a ghost cow that would trample anyone who slept past midnight. I was terrified for weeks." "You cried," Theo said, grinning, and there was nothing cruel in it, just the warm edge of an old memory finally allowed to be funny instead of a weapon. "I've never let myself forget that. I was 11. Still counts." "You're the worst," Micah said, but he was laughing too, and the sound of it in the dim barn, mixed with the rain and thunder, felt oddly intimate, like something private neither of them had shared with anyone in a long time. They talked through the worst of the storm that way, trading memories that had once been ammunition and was somehow now just stories. The time Theo's dog had chased Micah up a tree and refused to let him down for 2 hours. The time Micah had spray-painted Theo's mailbox as revenge and gotten caught red-handed. Literally, paint still on his fingers when his mother marched him over to apologize. Small things, stupid things. The kind of history that only existed between two people who had spent their whole childhoods locked in orbit around each other, unable to look away even when they wanted nothing more than distance. As the night wore on and the temperature kept dropping, Theo pulled the horse blanket over both of their shoulders without asking a simple, practical gesture, and Micah let him, telling himself it was only about the cold, though the warmth radiating from Theo's side felt like something else entirely, something he didn't have a name for yet. "You ever think about what would have happened?" Theo said quietly, after a long stretch of comfortable silence. "If we hadn't grown up hating each other? Like, if things had been different? Our dads, the fence, all of it. Pack." Micah considered the question longer than he probably needed to, watching the lightning flicker through the gaps in the barn wall, listening to the rain finally begin to soften into something steadier, less violent. "I don't know," he admitted. "Feels like it was always going to be like this. Like there wasn't room for anything else." "Yeah," Theo said. "I used to think that too." He paused, and Micah felt him shift slightly, the blanket tightening around both their shoulders as he turned, just enough that Micah could feel his gaze even without looking directly at him. "But I've been thinking about you a lot longer than I probably should have. Even before all this. Before Sarah, even." His voice dropped lower, rougher, like the words were costing him something to say. "Wasn't just hate back then. Not for me. Took me a long time to figure that out, and even longer to admit it." The words landed heavier than the thunder outside, and Micah felt his heart trip over itself, his breath catching somewhere in his throat. He turned his head slowly, and Theo was already looking at him, blue eyes steady, despite the vulnerability written plain across his face, like a man who'd already decided the risk was worth taking, and was simply waiting to see what it would cost him. "Theo," Micah started, though he didn't know what he meant to say after that, didn't know if he had the words for the way his chest had gone tight and warm all at once. The way 10 years of careful distance suddenly felt like it was folding in on itself. "You don't have to say anything," Theo said quickly, a flicker of old defensiveness rising, like he was already bracing for rejection. "Forget I said it. It's just the storm talking, probably."
"It's not the storm,"
Micah said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. Theo went still beside him, searching his face in the dim, flickering light, and neither of them moved away when their shoulders pressed together, when the space between them seemed to shrink, without either of them deciding to close it. The rain kept falling steady against the tin roof, softer now, almost gentle, and inside the old barn that had never belonged fully to either of their families, something shifted quietly between them, not resolved, not yet, but no longer denied. The morning came clear and washed-out blue, the kind of sky that only followed a Denhard storm, scrubbed clean of everything but the smell of wet earth and the distant call of a mourning dove somewhere in the tree line. Micah woke stiff in the old armchair. Theo had dragged into the barn's tack room the night before, his neck aching from the angle he'd slept at, and for a moment he forgot where he was, forgot everything that had happened in the dark, with the rain hammering down and Theo's shoulder pressed warm against his. Then he remembered, and his stomach dropped in a way that wasn't unpleasant so much as terrifying. They didn't talk about it over coffee, which Theo made too strong, and Micah drank anyway because his hands needed something to do. They didn't talk about it while they gathered tools and headed out to the fence line that still needed mending, the one that had started this whole mess weeks ago, back when Micah had still believed he could stay in Millbrook for 2 weeks, settle his father's affairs, and leave without looking back. The silence between them as they worked wasn't the comfortable kind. It crackled, taut, and electric, every accidental brush of hands over the same post. Every moment their eyes caught and then skittered away, waited with everything unsaid. Micah found himself hyper-aware of Theo's presence beside him, the way his forearms flexed as he drove a new post into the softened ground, the sheen of sweat gathering at his temple despite the cool morning, the occasional glances he thought Micah didn't notice. They worked for the better part of an hour like that, stringing wire, tamping earth, saying nothing beyond the bare mechanics of the job. Asterisk. Hand me that, hold this steady, watch your fingers, asterisk. Until the fence between the properties, the one that had divided two feuding families for longer than either of them had been alive, stood whole again for the first time in a decade. Micah straightened, wiping his palms on his jeans, and found Theo already watching him, wire cutters hanging loose from one hand, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like dread. "We should talk about it," Theo said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Like it cost him something to push the words out. Micah's heart gave that same unsteady lurch it had the night before. "Yeah," he agreed, because pretending otherwise felt like a lie. Neither of them could afford any more. Theo set the wire cutters down on the fence post, careful, deliberate, buying himself a few seconds. When he looked up again, the vulnerability from the night before hadn't vanished. If anything, it had sharpened, edged with a fear Micah recognized because he felt it too, coiled tight beneath his ribs. "My family's name means something around here," Theo said, staring out at the fields beyond the fence, gold and green, and listening with last night's rain. 3 generations of Hendersons on this land. Everybody in town's got an opinion about the Hendersons and the Ellisons, about that fence, about all of it, and I know how they'd talk if they knew. He stopped, shook his head, huffed out something that wasn't quite a laugh, and, "God, I sound like a coward." "You don't," Micah said quietly, though his own chest ached with the same fear, an old wound reopening. "I get it. Believe me, I get it. Do you?" Theo turned to face him fully, then blue eyes searching, raw in a way Micah had rarely seen on him, not even as boys. "Because I've spent 10 years telling myself what I felt back then was just kid stuff. Rivalry. Something to grow out of. And then you came back, and it wasn't gone, Micah. It was just waiting." Words landed like a physical thing, and Micah had to look away, out toward the tree line where the morning mist was still burning off in slow, ghostly ribbons. "You think I don't know that fear?" Micah said, and his voice cracked in a way he hated, in a way that betrayed just how much this cost him too. "You think I left because I hated it here? I left because staying hurt too much? Because I used to lie awake as a kid, furious at you, and it took me years to admit that the reason I couldn't stop thinking about you wasn't hate at all." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Theo's gaze, even though every old instinct screamed at him to run, to protect himself the way he'd learned to after all those years of feeling like the outsider, the other family's kid. Never good enough. Never safe enough. "I got hurt before, a long time ago by someone. I thought, it doesn't matter. I don't know if I can survive it again if this goes wrong." Theo's throat worked, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The space between them, thick with a decade of buried want and fear, tangled together so completely, neither man could separate one from the other. "I can't keep pretending you're just my rival," Theo said finally. Quiet, almost broken. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. But every time I look at you, I just—" He exhaled shakily, dragging a calloused hand through his sandy hair. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Micah. I'm tired of pretending." The wind moved through the grass between them, rustling the fence wire they'd just repaired, and Micah felt something in his chest crack open, wide and terrifying and impossible to close again. He took a step forward, then another. Theo went, still watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and disbelief, like he didn't quite trust what he was seeing, like he expected Micah to stop, to turn away, to prove all his fears right. Micah didn't stop. He closed the last of the distance between them, close enough to see the small scar along Theo's jaw from some childhood accident Micah couldn't remember the story of. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him, despite the cool morning air. His hand came up, hesitant, hovering near Theo's face before he let himself press his palm against the rough stubble of his cheek. "I don't want to pretend either," Micah whispered, and then he kissed him. It was tentative at first, barely more than a brush of lips, both of them holding back, terrified of shattering whatever fragile thing had bloomed between them. "To Segli-wa." Theo made a small, broken sound against his mouth, disbelieving, like he still couldn't quite trust this was real, and Micah felt the same disbelief echo through his own chest, 10 years of hatred and hurt dissolving into something achingly tender. When Theo's hand came up to cut the back of Micah's neck, pulling him closer, the kiss deepened, no longer tentative, but sure, grounded. Both of them, finally letting go of the fear they'd carried for so long. Micah's fingers curled into the front of Theo's shirt, holding on like he might drift away if he didn't, and Theo kissed him like he was trying to make up for 10 wasted years in a single moment, slow and deep and full of relief. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both of them breathing unsteadily, Theo let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob. 10 years, he murmured. 10 goddamn years. "I know," Micah said, voice thick with the same disbelief, the same aching relief. "I know." Neither of them moved a step back. The fence stood mended behind them, the morning sun breaking fully through the clouds, now gilding the fields in gold. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither man felt the need to run. Months passed the way seasons did in Millbrook, slow at first, then all at once. The way summer bled into autumn and autumn hardened into the first bite of winter before anyone quite noticed the shift. Micah stayed. He hadn't planned to. Not really. Not when he'd first come back for the funeral, with a suitcase packed for 2 weeks and a heart braced for nothing but grief and old resentment. But somewhere between the storm-soaked barn and the fence line and the countless quiet mornings that followed staying, had stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like the only thing that made sense. He'd taken up rebuilding his father's old farmhouse, board by board, room by room, sanding down warped floors and replacing rotted window frames, restoring what had been neglected for years under his father's declining health. It was slow work, made slower by how often Theo showed up unannounced with a thermos of coffee and an extra pair of hands, claiming he had nothing better to do, even though his own family's farm demanded plenty of his time. The town had talked, of course. Micah would be lying if he said otherwise. Millbrook wasn't the kind of place secrets stayed buried for long, and word had spread quickly enough once people noticed Theo Henderson's truck parked outside the old Ellison place more nights than not. There had been whispers at the general store, a few pointed looks after Sunday service, even a stilted conversation with Theo's father that had left both of them tense and silent for days afterward. But the whispers had softened over time, worn down the way all things eventually wore down in a small town where everyone had known everyone else long enough to run out of real venom. And when Theo's mother had shown up on Micah's half-finished porch one afternoon with a casserole dish and a stiff, awkward hug, Micah had understood, without either of them saying so directly, that some quiet truce had been reached. The fence between the properties still stood, mended and solid, but it didn't divide anything anymore, not really. Theo worked both halves of the land, now moving easily between the fields that had once been strictly forbidden territory, and Micah often found himself out working alongside him without a second thought, the old bitterness that had once poisoned that boundary line feeling like something from another lifetime entirely. It was dusk when Micah found himself standing at that same fence again, the mended one, the one that had witnessed the worst and best of what passed between the two families. The sky was doing that thing it did in late autumn, burning orange and deep violet at the edges, the fields stretching gold and quiet in every direction. Theo came up beside him the way he always did now, without needing to be asked, his presence as natural as the land itself. "You got sawdust in your hair," Theo said, reaching up to brush a hand through Micah's dark, tousled hair, the touch lingering longer than the observation required. "Comes with the job," Micah said, leaning into the touch despite himself, a small smile tugging at his mouth. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light shift and deepen over the fields, the fence post beneath Micah's palm, worn smooth from years of hands touching it, some in anger, most in labor, and now, finally, this. "Never thought I'd end up here," Micah admitted, after a while, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "Standing at this fence with you, not wanting to be anywhere else?" Theo huffed a soft laugh, bumping his shoulder gently against Micah's. "Used to dream about you falling in the creek behind your barn. Real vivid stuff. Very satisfying." "Charming," Micah said dryly, though warmth spread through his chest at the easy teasing, the kind that had once carried real venom and now carried only affection, worn, soft with time. Theo turned to face him. Then, blue eyes catching the last of the dying light, steady in a way that still made something in Micah's chest tighten, even after all these months. "I used to think this fence meant something different," he said. "Like it was the one thing keeping us apart. It took me 30 years to figure out it was never the fence." "No," Micah agreed softly. "It was never the fence." Theo reached for his hand, then fingers calloused and warm, lacing through Micah's with the same certainty that had carried them through every quiet, hard-won moment since that storm. Micah squeezed back, grounding himself in the solid, steady weight of him, in the life they'd slowly built out of 10 wasted years and 1 broken fence line. The sun dipped low behind the tree line, painting the sky in deep amber and violet, and somewhere in the stillness of dusk, 2 men who had spent their whole lives running from what they felt finally stood together without a single reason left to run. The land stretched quiet and golden around them, no longer divided, no longer contested, just theirs, together, steady as the ground beneath their feet.